The story begins with Brian Tanner, who is with his friend Pete climbing Glacier Peak, one of the most inaccessible mountains in the Cascade Range. When Brian asks for a brief break, Pete laughs at his friend's tiredness and continues climbing alone until Brian loses sight of him. He isn't worried about this since they are tied together by a rope, but then it suddenly pulls tight. Shortly after, Jake hears his friend shouting and starts calling for him, but there is no answer. The pulls on the rope continue, and Brian holds on tight to avoid being dragged up the rocks until suddenly he feels a jolt and becomes desperate when he sees the rope has snapped. Looking up with a look of horror, he can hardly believe the size of the creature perched on the rock watching him, roaring threateningly. Sometime later, we see that he survived the terrible encounter, but has become obsessed with that abominable creature. After studying maps and news, Brian packs his weapon and hires pilot Mark to take him back to the peak. Mark has known Brian since childhood and is somewhat suspicious of this sinister trip because he knows that Brian's father, Jake Tanner, disappeared in that very spot. However, when he asks about the reason for the trip, Brian tries to deflect and says he is just going skiing. Mark doesn't really believe this excuse and at least tries to arrange a meeting point to pick him up. However, Brian isn't in the mood for conversation and refuses the ride back, jumping out of the helicopter so quickly that he practically leaves the pilot talking to himself. After sliding on the snow for a while, he takes a snack break when he sees a long trail of enormous footprints. With a triumphant expression, he follows the trail until he arrives at a kind of narrow valley, where it's a bit darker and there is a heavy snowstorm. At that moment, sounds of growling begin to surround him, reverberating against the rocks and making it difficult to determine where the sound is coming from. Brian draws his weapon, but the snow monster is already right next to him when he sees it, and there is no time even to pull the trigger before the beast lunges. A few days later, his absence begins to worry his sister Nina, and she decides to go to his house. Upon finding the maps still open in the area of Glacier Peak, Nina deduces that he got lost out there and calls the emergency service, informing them that her brother is missing in the mountains. Unfortunately, she doesn't know anything about the planned itinerary, so there is little hope that the rescue team will find him. Frustrated, Nina arranges to meet with a group of friends at Era's ski bar. Like Brian, most of the young people in town have some military background, including Nina, who is also pursuing this path. The first to arrive is Rick, a former military colleague of Brian, who is also interested in Nina. This sparked a recent fight between the guys since Brian is a very protective brother and didn't want his friend getting close to her. The day after that was the last time Nina managed to speak with him, and since then, he hasn't answered her calls. Additionally, she reports that Brian has been acting strangely since returning home and seemed obsessed with the mountain. Coincidentally, Mark also arrives at Era's at that moment and is surprised to see Brian's sister, as he hasn't seen her in a long time. He tells both of them everything he knows and reveals that the searches are not going well due to the severe storm in the mountains. Noting the tone of guilt in his voice, Nina says she knows her brother and that there is no way to stop him from doing what he wants. Rick is much less sympathetic toward the pilot, also remembering that Mark was suspended from the rescue team after an accident. The atmosphere becomes somewhat tense, and Mark leaves, promising to keep Nina informed since he still receives communications from the control tower. At Glacier Peak, rescue agents Ronnie and Bill find ski tracks that may belong to Brian. As an avalanche approaches, they decide to split up to cover more ground quickly, and Ronnie soon discovers a cell phone lying on the ground. Getting closer, he hears a strange growl coming from behind the rocks, but doesn't seem too worried and grabs the radio to call his colleague. However, the warning is interrupted when the monster suddenly attacks, knocking Ronnie into the snow. Bill begins calling him on the radio, having found the communication cut off, but soon discovers the reason, being attacked as well. At the same time, the rest of the gang arrives at Era's for the meeting. Erlander and the couple, John and Stacy. Rick summarizes the situation for them, and Erlander says Brian might just be camping up there, but Nina is sure that is not the case, as he would have warned them. It is then that Mark returns with the concerning news that there is a very serious avalanche on one side of the mountain, and 2 men have gone missing during the search. Nina panics upon hearing this, and Rick encourages the group of friends to go personally to the peak to find Brian. Mark thinks that is madness and refuses to take them, even when Nina appeals to his friendship with her father. He only changes his mind when Rick says he will find a more sober pilot and schedules the departure time reluctantly. John and Stacy begin to argue as soon as they step away from the group, as he no longer wants the military life. John thinks it's time to have children, but his wife can't get excited about anything other than a risky mission. At the agreed time, the five board the helicopter, and Rick examines the map, looking for the best landing point. Still on the defensive about Mark, he suggests a very difficult location, and the pilot complains but accepts the challenge, ultimately impressing his rival with his skill. During the landing, Rick sees Erlander stashing a weapon in his jacket, and the young man explains that he carries that everywhere. Before leaving, Mark warns the group that there will be a storm by evening and asks them to keep him informed, arranging a time to pick them up the next morning. Looking at the landscape, Erlander seems to enter a kind of trance, then says he thought he heard something. Rick takes charge and releases the group to ski when he finds a safe stretch, telling them not to stray too far. Everything goes well at this first moment, and the five reunite without problems, but no one found any clues, and now the satellite signal is failing. Trying to figure out where they ended up, Nina opens a map and is startled to conclude that it was precisely there that her father went missing. Only now does she realize that this was exactly 25 years ago, leaving no doubt that Brian's expedition has something to do with their father. Jake disappeared a few weeks before Nina was born, but her brother was already old enough to carry the trauma. Suddenly, an avalanche begins to come down towards them very quickly, and Rick shouts to alert the group. They ski to a large rock to take cover, but this only decreases the impact a little. The snow cloud engulfs everyone, and the group gets buried after it passes, struggling to get out little by little. Then Stacy starts shouting and says that John was dragged into the ravine. Nina suggests calling emergency services, but Rick regrets to inform her that it was precisely John who had the satellite phone. Desperate, Stacy decides to descend the canyon wall to look for her husband down below. Rick won't let her do that and goes in her place, finding John crumpled in a corner. The young man is alive but has broken his left leg and is coughing up blood. Rick asks the others to come down to help him and warns that he couldn't find the backpack, so the phone is still lost. They decide to use John's skis as a stretcher, and Rick asks Erlander's help with this, but he is catatonic again and takes time to respond. Aside from all these problems, the group is now in a location far away from the planned site, and it will be difficult to reach the safe area before the storm starts. We also see that the creature is quickly descending the mountain, now very close to where they are. Very shaken by the accident, Stacy tells John that he is right, and it is time to think about having children. Making an effort to speak, he says this is not the time for family plans, and suspects she is saying this because he is on the brink of death. At the same time, Mark is drinking at Era's and trying not to go crazy with the news on the radio about the storm in the mountains, which appears to be much more severe than expected. The makeshift stretcher isn't working very well, and John screams in pain with every meter they slide. Stacy fights with Erlander over the excessive urgency, and he starts yelling that they need to get out of there soon. Not understanding anything, Rick responds that there is no risk of an avalanche, but Erlander says the group is vulnerable to the enemy, speaking as if he were in a battlefield rather than on top of a mountain. Trying to calm him down, Rick assures him that they are alone and there is no danger at all. As soon as he says that, the monster leaps right in the middle of them and starts spreading terror. Erlander completely freezes, and Stacy throws a helmet at the creature's back, provoking its fury. John won't let the monster retaliate and starts screaming to save his wife. The plan works, and the creature grabs him before climbing the wall and disappearing up top. Unconsoled, Stacy blames Erlander for his inaction and digs up past accusations, saying he has always been the weakest link in combat. Rick breaks up the fight and takes back control of the team, reminding them that they need to get out of there before that thing returns. Shortly after it gets dark, the group manages to reach an abandoned resort where they can take shelter until the weather improves. Rick is shocked to find the front door unlocked and is very surprised when Brian greets them with a weapon drawn. Stacy warns that there is a monster outside, and he responds that he came specifically to hunt it, without asking for anyone's help. However, this aggressive attitude begins to change as they explain that their adventure has already cost 3 lives, and Brian resolves to explain everything to the group. He never believed the explanations about his father's disappearance, and according to his research, it wasn't the only case. Many climbing groups and even entire families have disappeared on that mountain over several decades, always around the same time as reports of an unknown animal surfaced. Every mountain has its deadly dangers, and many people go missing trying to reach any high enough peak, but in Glacier Peak, the bodies never appear. Then Brian, who was up there with Pete not long ago, saw the monster with his own eyes. The entire story sounds crazy, but the group just saw the creature as well, and Brian describes it accurately. Still resentful at his irresponsibility, Rick says it is time to leave and becomes furious when Brian warns that he will stay. He planned this for many years and will only leave the mountain after killing the beast. Rick starts yelling at him, saying John is dead because of this obsession, but Brian retorts that it was Rick who brought John to Glacier Peak. The two are still arguing when a paw breaks the window and strikes Erlander. Rick and Brian join forces to shoot at it, managing to scare the beast off, and then rush to help the young man. Rick asks why Brian didn't take safety measures, and he says that wasn't the plan because the intention was to lure the monster inside. Now the group scrambles, dragging furniture against doors and windows in a hurry because the monster is already back. It shakes some of the entrances with roars of fury until it finds one still uncovered and breaks another pane. Brian scares it off with gunshots again, but the situation is becoming increasingly untenable, and Rick orders the others to flee through the back door. As soon as the group exits, it becomes evident that they will not make it far in that snowstorm, especially now that they left their equipment inside. As if that weren't enough, a second monster appears right in front of them, shocking even Brian. With little alternative, the group turns around and blocks themselves inside the house again. At this point, Mark is completely drunk and very regretful for having cooperated on that mission. He goes to speak with Wayne, his old boss, and confesses to having taken a group of young people to the most dangerous place on Glacier Peak just before a storm. Furious, Wayne berates the former employee and tries to expel him, but Mark refuses to leave without knowing if the young people have been rescued. Meanwhile, the group is cornered by the pair of monsters, and the ammunition is nearly out. To make matters worse, Erlander loses control again and points his weapon at Rick, screaming that there is nowhere to hide from the beasts and that everyone will die there soon. Rick also points his weapon at him, and everyone implores the two to calm down until Brian grabs Erlander by the legs and knocks him over. Rick restrains him and takes his weapon, while Nina calls for a moment of attention to announce that the monsters seem to have gone away. Taking advantage of the opening, the group works to block off all possible pathways, finishing just as the growls start again. However, as soon as one of the monsters begins to smash the door, they realize it is too strong and nothing will hold it back. Everyone rushes to the kitchen as the door gives way and the two monsters invade. Rick and Stacy decide to fight to the end, gathering sharp utensils with which they can defend themselves. Erlander is so distraught that he won't even pick up his weapon again and apologizes to Stacy for letting John die. When a paw forces its way through the door, Brian begins to shoot, and Rick tells him to stop, as they have few bullets left and it's better to save them for when the beast is in clear view. Once again, the door is smashed within seconds, and the survivors are forced to flee to the next room, which this time is the pantry. Rick becomes nervous upon realizing that there is no other exit, knowing that soon the monsters will enter there as well. However, Brian knows the place better and shows that there is a trap door in the floor leading to the boiler room. The plan is to stay in there quietly until the danger passes, but that will only work if everyone descends before the monsters arrive, and the pantry door has begun to be shaken. Seeing that this might be the last chance, Erlander holds the door and tells the others to go ahead, saying he won't be the weakest link this time. His friends refuse to let him sacrifice himself, but he is determined and suddenly opens the door, exiting the pantry with only a knife. The beast is right in front of him now, and Erlander begins to challenge it. His screams can be heard inside the pantry, along with the horrible sound of its claws tearing into his body. The four survivors then descend to the boiler room, knowing that this is their last refuge. However, from the sounds coming from above, they realize that the creatures are leaving and decide to go back up. The entire ground floor is in complete disarray, and there is a trail of blood from the pantry to the entrance door. This is their only chance to get out of there without being attacked, but it would be very difficult to face the snowstorm at night. Therefore, they decide to use this chance differently, taking the time to plan a counterattack as if the monsters were part of the enemy army. Brian reveals that the resort was built after the war by a soldier, and Stacy even manages to find some grenades he had stored. He also takes the opportunity to settle things with Rick and apologizes for interfering in his flirting with Nina. The group spends the rest of the night preparing while the creatures devour the remains of their victims in the lair. In the morning, Mark sees that the weather has improved and asks Wayne to send a helicopter to the mountain, but he says it may still be bad up there, and he won't risk anyone else. The only pilot able to get there in those conditions is Mark himself, and Wayne refuses to let him fly, even when he says the group will wait for him at the meeting point at 7 in the morning. Wayne also warns that if Mark takes off without authorization, that will be his last flight in life, as he will make sure to revoke his license. Meanwhile, the survivors are leaving the resort ready for battle, and the two monsters do not take long to appear. The group then lures them inside, but now with a route defined by them. The path leads to a narrow corridor where the beasts are forced to advance in a line, making it easier for the shooters to do their work. The monster coming in front is taken down right away, but the second attacks Stacy before the others can intervene. The other three rush outside and block the door with logs, then Brian throws grenades inside, alongside several gallons of flammable material. They then move away as quickly as possible, narrowly escaping the devastating explosion that destroys the resort. After digging their gear out from under the snow, they prepare for the descent to the meeting point, and then Nina looks back with an expression of astonishment. The second monster survived the explosion and is roaring again, ready to chase them. At least now they are also ready to flee, and they can only hope to be faster as the beast gallops closely behind. Rick ends up tipping over during the descent and is too injured to continue. Brian tries to carry him, but Rick knows that would mean the end for the three of them and tells the siblings to save themselves. Nina bids him farewell with a kiss, and Brian gives her a grenade before departing, promising to return with the helicopter. Rick uses the grenade as the creature arrives, triggering an avalanche that almost sweeps the other two below. They take cover behind a rock and can hardly believe when they hear the beast's roar, which escaped unscathed again. Brian loses patience and forces his sister to continue without him, deciding to use those last bullets in a final attempt to avenge their father. He misses the first shot and aims very carefully the second time, with the monster now just a few meters away. Then we see that Mark has decided to challenge Wayne and Rick has managed to escape the avalanche. Nina is waiting for her brother, but the creature appears instead. Therefore, she has to escape skiing and only saves herself with a risky maneuver, jumping straight into the helicopter. Mark breathes a sigh of relief and is ready to leave when the monster also jumps and clings to the helicopter. Rick suddenly appears and takes the grenade from Nina, throwing it into the creature's mouth, which finally blows up. Nina is confused to see Rick, and he explains that Mark rescued him after the first grenade exploded. She asks about Brian, and he regrets to say that he is gone, but Nina says that at least he fulfilled his dream of revenge.